Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. Well, it's that time of year when publishers are hoping that millions of people will be out buying books for presents for Christmas. And it has to be said that the best-selling lists at the moment are stuffed with celeb biographies and memoirs. None of that, I am delighted to report, with us today, but we did think it was a good moment to talk about rather more interesting biography, both on the page and the screen. I'm joined by Aman Sethi, author of a cracking book about a house painter and his mates living on the streets of Delhi, by Roger Graef, the award-winning documentary filmmaker, who homes in on the lives of doctors, sick children, prisoners and many more, by the fine and rather unusual biographer Jenny Uglow, whose latest book's about a little-known but extraordinary Cumbrian woman. So none of them conventional biographical storytellers. And I'm going to start by talking to a man whose films have won him recently a very major award, the Grierson, and whose latest film's a portrait of that iconic musician, Jamaica's Bob Marley. Kevin, it's an obvious question, I suppose, Kevin Macdonald, but how do you choose a biographical subject? Because a lot of your films are, as it were, conventional narrative feature films.
Well, in the case of Marley, I suppose what interested me was that here's someone who is apparently so well known around the world. You can go almost anywhere in the world and there are murals of Bob Marley. You hear his music in marketplaces from, Delhi to Indonesia, and yet there isn't very much really known about him as a man. He only gave a handful of interviews, and he's really frustrating and infuriating in the few interviews he did give. He doesn't give much away. There is no moving footage of him for the first 26 years of his life, only a handful of photographs. In fact, he reminded me a little bit of your subject, Jenny, who again is sort of in some way absent in the biography. And so that was what interested me, was just who was this man that we all think we know but we don't know? And
yet when you set out, you don't know what interviews you're going to get. In fact, I think Bob Marley's daughter, who remains very angry with him, was a sort of pivotal and crucial interviewee that you found for the film. But you don't know, presumably, when you start making the film, what the quality is of the...
No, that's the sort of adventure of making these sorts of films, is that you have to just decide to make it, and then accept what you're given, and find things that are good. You've taken the check, you've got the commission from the Christian editors, and you've told them you're going to make a brilliant film, but you've no idea of what that brilliant film's going to be. And so I think you become a bit mystical, actually, because you sort of believe that something will come up and you will meet those great people. And I remember it was halfway through the making of this film and I thought, I haven't discovered anything that isn't already in common knowledge.
So there's that period of panic.
And there is a period of total panic, and then suddenly it clicks and you do a couple of interviews with people, and my God, there's a whole different way of looking at this man's life, and you start to understand him in a what you think yourself anyway. You think you understand him in a deeper way. But the other thing that happens, of course, when you make this sort of film, is that you are always defining your subject through the words of others. So he's a sort of negative space in the middle. And so by the end of the film, I feel like, I feel like the audience know Bob, but they don't really know him. They know what everybody else has said about him, and of course there's lots of lies and deceptions. And
still the negative sort of hovering presence, sort of darkly in the middle of it all.
Exactly. I know that makes for an interesting subject as well, though, doesn't it? Because he retains some mystique, some mystery. He's not fully defined as a person, and that makes a legend, I suppose.
So we understand now why you go for that subject. Aman Sethi, in your book, A Free Man, again, actually, you've got somebody who is a presence throughout the book, but is constantly telling little parts of stories about his life, which we may or may not believe, and refusing to reveal crucial other parts of his life. So in a sense, there is a sort of parallel, I think, there. But how did you start to settle out in this sort of project to tell the story of a group of day labourers in Delhi?
Well, the project sort of took shape because in the run-up to the Commonwealth Games in Delhi in 2010, there was a period of sanitization of the city where working-class people were being moved out, and there was an attempt to transform Delhi from a predominantly industrial, productive city into a kind of city of finance and services. So I was interested in trying to recover a sort of working history of Delhi. So I started looking for people who... I thought the idea of the construction worker was very interesting because these were the people who were being sort of asked to build the city that would have no place for them once it was complete. So it seemed like a kind of interesting, into the current shape of Delhi. So that's how I started out.
And Mohammed Ashraf, who is the central figure, the painter in this book, you chose him because he was just remarkably gabby and unusual? What?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, I mean, I think this speaks to this entire question of biography, right? That do we tend to privilege the eloquent and leave out the kind of taciturn? And unfortunately, I think, and of course, when I was starting out, I was 23, so I wasn't really thinking about these ideas of simmering silences in the background. I was just like, hey, look at you. Yeah. so that's how I mean, we sort of struck up a sort of rapport, and then after that, it just kind of came.
Fantastic. We're going to come back to both of those subjects, but I'm going to keep moving around the table and ask Roger. You're not a biographer. I can't imagine a biographical Roger Graef film, but what you do is you arrive into the lives of people, and they may be kids waiting for adoption. You've had BAFTA and Grierson nominations for that film, and you look at a group of people. You're very closely with them, or the audience thinks they're living very closely alongside these people, and then you're back out again, and their lives carry on.
That's right, and what we want is that the movie, as it were, to continue in people's minds afterwards. And the randomness that Aman was talking about is actually something that's important to us, because we don't come in and say we want the star, the most controversial, the most charismatic. What we really want is something typical. And I've always seen that as a test in a way. And the randomness that Kevin is talking about, that you hope at some point along the way, having got the commission, it'll all come good, sometimes is really very late in the day. But I do trust this, and time again, in the adoption film, for example, when the birth mother decides to try and reclaim the right to indeed have the child back, or at least visiting rights after a number of years, 5 years, and the child has been with another family who want to adopt. That's suddenly an incredibly, almost novelistic challenge between the birth mother and, it goes back to the Bible, to Solomon. And yet that just happened on our watch, because Claire John's making the film was so close to all the parties, and we needed their consent, that we won their trust, and both mothers trusted us.
So you get alongside living people in stressful or just very interesting, difficult situations. Hospital would be another example of that, or prisons. And you know ultimately that something interesting is going to happen, don't you?
Well, this is where I trust life. I mean, I like Kevin's word mystical, because in a way we enter the real world. And what I say, tomorrow I'm giving a talk to cybercrime people who are invisible as well as their subject, because there isn't a narrative. Nobody has a narrative about cybercrime. They can't understand it. They don't know who the victims are. It all happens in the air. And that's their problem. Whereas in ordinary life that we film, there are these mini narratives, sometimes very small, as in Aman's book. But the minute you care what's going to happen because somebody's just disappeared from the market, or, you just literally small things, like in another wonderful film in Great Ormond Street, where a girl simply is frightened to have a needle for injection. She needs a kidney. And Simon Gilchrist, who made that film, just followed this girl time and time again while they tried to put a needle in her and save her life. She wouldn't have it. Now, that's a very small thing. That's not life and death, but it actually is, and it feels like it when you watch the film.
Jenny Uglow, you've in your biography, you've done group biographies, the Lunar Men, for instance. You've clearly got an enthusiasm for the north of England, because where it's Thomas Bute, lots of your characters come from there. In your new book, you have focused on a woman who's really very little known, but she left behind her this extraordinary church in the village of Rhea, I think. Yes. Rhea, you pronounce it, outside Carlisle. When you're looking for a subject, what are you looking for?
Oh, that's really interesting. The subjects sort of take you and or take me and live with me, and I think I really do want to write about this work, and usually it's because of something strange or that they've created. I mean, it might be Hogarth's Prince, and you think, who who is this man that caught that life of London so well, or Buick? What kind of person knew his country? And in this particular case, it was even more fascinating because it's a church and a landscape, and yet as you approach it, it's different to whatever you expect. You expect sort of dog's tooth carving and Romanesque, and you find amazing gargoyles of turtles whooshing out at you, and you find fossils and things. So it's just a sort of nosiness, I think, a curiosity. You want to know who is the person behind it.
And as Kevin Macdonald pointed out, your character, Sarah Losh, destroyed almost everything that she had written. And so there's a sort of dark absence at the heart of your subject. It's kind of testing. Yes,
it is. It is testing, and I think in both cases, like with Marley's songs, and here with these buildings and these, what you have is the work, and you just at the end you want people to come back to that, and they can kind of make their own interpretation. And what I do is to sort of shape and track her life through, and luckily there are a couple of things that remain where you have a very strong voice but quite contradictory. So it is like this person just talking over your shoulder, but only now and then.
It occurs to me that in different ways all your subjects are a bit like sort of sculptures covered in pieces of mirror. That you can see a sort of a shape in the middle there, but you're also very interested in all the things reflected by the subjects you've chosen. And I'm thinking in the Bob Marley film, one of the things that's going to strike people very strongly, things like just how primitive, without electricity, without connections, the early life up in the mountains is, these little shacks where people are living.
Well, I think one of the things that really struck me was that Bob is the only third world superstar. That's what they used to call him in the 70s. He's the only person from the developing world who really did grow up in a kind of shack, in a hut in the mountains without electricity, in a very primitive way, who went on to become one of the kind of icons of popular culture. And so, of course, that means that his music, his songs, are infused with all sorts of concerns that the Beatles or the Stones or Elton John are just not going to be, because they grew up in suburban bliss.
And it follows through that theme of an unusual life in terms of sort of rock stars or pop stars, because he also, much later on, gets heavily drawn into the politics of Jamaica, which, like the politics of so many African countries and so many other parts of the world, incredibly divided and very quickly very violent indeed.
Yes, I mean, he was defined in a way in his later life by his Rastafarianism, by his belief in Rasta, and the belief that Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was the second coming of Christ, which sounds kind of very. It's one of those things that's very difficult to put yourself in his shoes and say, why would you think that is possible?
Particularly when you show the news footage at the time of him arriving, this tiny little figure in his kind of rather ridiculous sort of Western military outfit.
This ill-fitting suit ill-fitting military suit that he's wearing, and he arrives in Jamaica, and there's thousands and thousands of Rastas out on the street with their extraordinary sort of hair that's been let to grow in all directions, and they all believe that they're seeing a sort of mass hypnosis, that they see nail marks in his hands, and they believe that his little pooch dogs that he's carrying, why is he carrying these pooch dogs? They must be lions in disguise. That's what somebody told me. Those Pekingese are actually lions in disguise. But that was the thing that defined Bob, and a lot of his music is about that religion. And he then found himself caught up in the party politics, very violent party politics of Jamaica in the 70s, which was really a left-right kind of warfare, kind of proxy war, I guess, as part of the Cold War. And he didn't want to be, because he believed that all political solutions were false, and that really only through God and the will of Jah, which is what they called God. A fair
amount of weed as well.
Would you find any peace, and would you find any solutions to social problems. But nevertheless, he found himself caught up in this politics and forced in a way to take sides, and ended up being shot, and somebody tried to assassinate him the night before he was doing a concert that was meant to be a peace concert to bring the sort of warring parties together. And he's...
So that kind of theme and the very complicated sex life gets you away from what can often happen, it seems to me, with biopics of rock stars, which it becomes an endless series of stories about struggles with their agent and their record label, and and whether the band is splitting up or coming together again. Not that it isn't interesting, but it's always the same, isn't it?
It is always the same, and I think that's partly why Bob is interesting, because he does come from this totally different background, and because also he has inspired such devotion in his followers around the world to this day. I mean, the thing that actually got me interested in making this film was because I made a feature film in Uganda several years ago called The Last King of Scotland, and when I was making that, I went into the slums of Kampala and found that there were all these Rastas there, that there was murals of Bob Marley everywhere, that they were listening to Bob's music, and they were treating him like some sort of messiah, I suppose, himself. And I thought, this is amazing. There's nobody else. There's no other person in popular culture who's had that kind of impact, who is a sort of a philosopher or a guide to life to people all around the world. So I was intrigued to make the film about him because of that background.
Jenny?
Yes, the complication of the politics and the Rastafarianism, and also the music, which is the area that he does, I think, make compromises in about the kind of music and reaching people. And yet at the end, he seems to retain that sort of naivety and sincerity. Do you think he did? He's not corrupted by the music.
By the music system. I think he isn't corrupted, because I think he's practically unique in the sort of rock star world, in that he was so religious. And so even though he compromised in his music, he would say, oh, well, I'll make a more disco version of this because that will reach the kind of 70s black American audience. He was doing that because he thought, well, that will bring people to me, but then they'll listen to my real music and they'll get the message and they'll be touched. I think the big tragedy for him was, of course, that he was willing to compromise so much, particularly in America, but black Americans weren't interested in his music, and that was the audience he thought he was writing for, because they were part of the biggest portion of the African diaspora.
Roger?
Well, one of the things that makes that your film into a really interesting documentary is the layers. It's because it isn't just about the rise from rags to riches, but it's also that he does go on a journey that's very distinctive and rather elusive, and so you're drawn deeper and deeper into the question of the mystery of who really is Bob Marley. And every time you see a fragment of interview, you want to know more. So it's a kind of you really seduce people into really caring about what happens to him.
Well, I think a lot of that is also
shock at the end.
Is also to do with the length of the film. Which
is it's quite a long
film. It's a very long film. It's 2.5 hour long documentary.
And
the thing about
only felt like 2 hours.
The thing about that is that, of course, I got my producers going, "What? Are you kidding?" The traditional biographical documentary is an hour, maybe 90 minutes if you're lucky, if you're on Arena or something. But of course, that then forces you into certain kind of structures which you have to abide by. Really, a sort of 3-act narrative to somebody's life. In the space of 2.5 hours, you can go off on all sorts of digressions, you can hear sorts of details, you can get away from that very simplistic structuring and actually find something that's more ambiguous and, I think, to me, more layered and fascinating for that reason. But it takes maybe some patience on the viewer's part.
Roger Graef again.
Yes, I want to make a kind of comparison between what we do and what all the three of you do, which is that you give us a lot of context. You know, you're really in the market in Delhi. I learned more about Delhi from reading your book than I had ever known in my life before. But lots of little quirky bits, the slang, the architecture, the smell of the place, all of that comes out of your book. And in Jenny, I had a wonderful history lesson about, I mean, it wasn't just wonderful, it was very deep and dense, and rather, again, I was drawn into this and didn't want to go there. Whereas what we do is we provide fragments. It's a bit like archaeology of the present, where we provide fragments of the present, and we say to the audience, now you follow this story. You make up your own version of this. You know, which mother should get the child? Should the treatment be given to a child who would suffer more and maybe die anyway? And these are open questions. We don't have the answer. We just hand the question to the audience in a very different way.
Aman, I want to come and look a little bit more in detail at your book, A Free Man. Very interesting you call it A Free Man. Let's explain why, because there's a sort of pivotal conversation, isn't there, in the book?
Yeah, so I guess the premise of A Free Man was predominantly whether you want to work through an established system of employers and masters, or do you want to actually kind of strike out on your own? And this notion of freedom, I realized when I started working in this space, was this kind of strange driving force, because you would always want to know, why would you leave home, which would have its own, of course, set of problems, but why would you leave home to come and sleep on a street? It seems somewhat counterintuitive. But over a period of time, through these periods of conversation, you realize that in some ways, work has a way of kind of holding us in, and in some ways preventing us from actually becoming the kind of people we want to.
So these are people who actively don't want a salary or a regular wage. They want to be paid when they want to work, and then use the money for cigarettes or booze or whatever, and then come back to work when they choose to.
Yeah, it's almost like a kind of freelance version of what I do. So you sort of are freelance construction workers as opposed to employee construction workers, and I think what that allows them to do is as Ashraf says at some point, that the master owns our work, but he does not own us. And I think in a country like India, which is largely kind of driven by property relations and hierarchies, kind of the escape from who you are back home to the kind of figure of anonymity in the city has a kind of incredible appeal of its own.
Though what you pay for that is you live a short life and you die of TB or whatever it might be, and you've probably got a very, very low standard of health.
Yeah, but I think that has been a kind of, because you don't want to fall into that trap of all freedom is slavery, right? You don't want to be like, well, if you leave home, you're going to die alone, because of course that is a concern. But at the same time, I mean,
these guys have quite a good time, at least some of the time, don't they? I mean, those great long drinking bouts must have been fun. You were on them, so they must have been good fun.
Well, I think all of us have some fun some of the time, right? And I think the whole premise was that, and I think this in some ways would speak to I think a lot of the work that we all do, which is to try and make a different, to try and present another way of life as possible, right? As opposed to saying that all of us must grow up and have the same dreams and must fight the same kind of painful battles with our agents, or be kind of stuck in these kind of very clear narrative tracts. That there's a kind of chaos that allows us to dream differently, and it shouldn't be a situation where only the elite are allowed to dream and the working class must struggle. I mean,
absolutely. The book it really reminded me of was George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, because again it's got that interest in the detail, exactly how much money people get paid for doing what and how they spend it and the shape of their days. And you weren't down and out yourself, but you were living alongside Mohammed and his friends for quite a lot of the time, weren't you?
Yeah, I was spending a significant period of time and kind of moving in and moving out, because I also had a job on the side that as a kind of regular journalist. But like I said, it's a question of why would you want to go into this degree of detail? And I guess one of the reasons you would want to go into it is that the shape of the life emerges from the shape of the work. So
absolutely,
that would be a reason.
Jenny?
One of the compelling things about it is this idea of friendship. And they are friends for a time, and then they lose sight of each other, and so on. But together, they seem to make sense of their lives, or the way you use it, through this amazing telling of stories, not actual practical times. This happened next, but wonderful sort of invented myths of times past that they exchange like a kind of barter, and I think that's a fascinating structure, both for understanding your life, but also for you as a writer.
Actually, the other thing I wanted to throw in was that it seems to me you've shed a light on an invisible group of people, which is what we try to do ourselves, and Kevin's wonderful Life in a Day does that. But it's to do with cities and how cities grow. And every city in the world now is full of people who have left some life behind and arrived in this existential limbo and live hand to mouth. Now, a lot of us who are concerned about criminology say they are ready to go into crime, and these guys live on the edge of the law. But to enter their world so sympathetically is really quite important, to understand how cities are actually growing on the edges with invisible people, and it goes from Moscow to Mombasa,
Because the other thing we should say, is that at the background of these lives, there is slum clearance and civic programs and politics all going on.
Yeah, to sort of tie it up with your point about, say, George Orwell's book, there's this great section in the London sections where he's where he's talking about kind of sleeping rough and, you know.
So you're well aware of the Orwell connection.
Oh yeah, I mean, I grew up in India, so we sort of studied him in high school. Shooting the elephant was like this kind of thing that all of us had to read. And there's this great bit, right, where he talks about how the municipal laws say you cannot sleep or lie down on the street at night, but you can sit up. So there is a way in which you're basically criminalizing lying down in the darkness, which is an absolutely bizarre way to kind of, you know, I mean, of course you're on the edge of crime because you're about to fall over, literally, right? And once you're horizontal, you've suddenly committed a crime. So I mean, I guess criminology is kind of interesting, but I think it would be interesting to look at how you create the figure of the criminal. So yeah, I mean that would be.
There's a great period as well when Orwell decides he must be arrested. And so he gets himself as drunk as he possibly can and finds it really, really hard to be arrested. The police are being terribly nice to him and it's not working. Kevin, you want to come in on that?
I have a connection to this. Actually, the film I'm trying to make next is an adaptation of Down and Out in Paris and London.
No.
Yes.
How funny. Okay.
Spooky. But I mean, one of the things that your book very definitely reminded me of Orwell's. And one of the things that really resonated was just this kind of anthropological aspect of it, is those sort of details that in Orwell he talks about people sleeping on the rope. I remember there's this sort of idea that you're allowed to go to these doss houses. If you can't afford to buy a bed, you can sleep hanging on a rope. But there's also the character of Boris, who's in Paris, in Down and Out in Paris, who reminded me of Ashraf a little bit, in that he has an optimism about him. He has a philosophical view of life. But you're never quite sure if he's heroic or delusional, and I think that I felt the same about Ashraf.
Yeah, I think Boris. I love this book, right? So I'm really glad you sort of brought this up. But Boris has this great moment where Boris says, you know, they're sort of trying to get a job, and Boris is like slapping himself. And George Orwell is like, you know, what you doing? And he says, it's a crime to look hungry. It makes people want to kick you. And it's sort of true that in some way...
Nice rosy face. That's all right. Roger Graef, I want to turn to some of these sort of moral issues, really, in your kind of filmmaking, because you get alongside people, you spend a lot of time with them, watching them at stressful times of their life, and yet your interests as a filmmaker and their interests are not always identical, are they?
Well, no. I mean, they're struggling either, you know, to decide what to do with their child or whether to adopt or not, or children. I mean, the biography, you said I'm not a biographer, but I think Claire's film's about these young children waiting to be adopted.
Yes.
You know, you kind of do get their lives. They only are 5 years old, 6 years old. You've been waiting all that time to be adopted, but their own response to that is very interesting. And why I was saying wherever possible,
completely heartbreaking, that film, by the way. It's absolutely... wrenching. Lots of tears.
I cry every time too, if that's any consolation. But the point is that we want people to engage with invisible people. That's why I like Aman's book as well so much. And that the notion that you don't just care about celebrities or politicians or people who are the sort of at the top of our visibility, but there's the 7/10 underwater all have important lives. And one of the things I feel quite importantly, and I feel that the people in our films also get something from this, is that paying attention to ordinary lives empowers people to value them. Whereas if you think the only way you're going to live is to get on to X Factor or be discovered famous, by Arsenal, it means you don't do any of the work and the care and the attention. You don't respect your own experience. And what we're trying to do is pay respect to normal dilemmas, which are sometimes very dramatic, as we see in those films. Well, and that's important. That's the morality for my work.
Heartbreaking children, but also you pay attention to people doing good work, whether they may be in the probation service or they may be doctors in Great Ormond Street, on days when they have achieved something remarkable and on days when they fail as well.
Now, Andrew, you put your finger on exactly the thing that runs right through our work, which is giving people in positions of authority, like police chiefs and so on, to say, I don't know. And the consultants in Great Ormond Street, right through the 9 films we made there, time and again say, this is really hard, we don't know what to do. And I thought at the time that they would really resist this. And some of the fundraisers at Great Ormond Street were very worried after the first series of 3. In fact, they found the money went up. More people gave in the money. The next series of 6, which are just as good, we were told by Great Ormond Street that the people who get the most out of it, the consultants love it, the nurses love it, but are the parents coming in with their children, not expecting as much as they would have done if they hadn't seen those films.
Because they understand that you can't simply turn up and someone will flick a few switches and make your child right again.
Exactly. And that, it seems to me, that refocusing, that reframing of the difficult experience is really, for me, that's worth more than any BAFTA. It really is. That's why we do it.
You mentioned the word BAFTA. You garlanded with... I don't know how you can be garlanded with BAFTAs. You've got lots of them on the shelves.
Heavy.
They're too heavy to be garlanded with. And you were up for a Grierson for this film in the same ceremony that Kevin won his great award. More perhaps than writing books, the question of funding always hovers around this. How important is the sort of prize-giving element to keep attention focused on filmmakers?
I think you have to ask commissioning editors of that. I mean, to be honest, I was given the equivalent of the Grierson thing with the BAFTA Lifetime Fellowship. And I remember thinking, when's my next film? When do we start? It was not the highlight of my life by any means. And by the time the 3 hours of the evening were up, everyone was drunk anyway. It was just, that's not the point. It's really just getting the chance to share these lives, which is why I like the other.
And we should say Grierson himself, who was the sort of pioneering British documentary maker, for whom the awards are named, wouldn't be making films, certainly like the films he's making now, would he?
No, the films that Kevin is or I am. No, it's true. Grierson had a very different moral point of view, which was heroic workers, and it was shot with low angles and lots of lighting and huge control and lots of music.
And W.H. Shorten doing the words.
There is one film that I think actually reminded me of Aman's book, which Grierson made, which is called Housing Problems. Which sounds
made it.
Well, it's produced by Grierson. And in that, it's the first film. It's famous for being the first film where working class characters are interviewed and speak spontaneously, or as spontaneously as they could, about the situation in the slum that they're living in. And there's very funny moments where woman's describing the rat,
and you can see the
crawling
damp
over her bed,
and you can see the damp
behind, and it's very forceful still today because it has a spontaneity to it.
So we're talking about under-considered lives, and I want to come to Jenny Uglow's book, The Pine Cone, because you've done Charles II and Thomas Buick and Hogarth and Elizabeth Gaskell and lots of pretty well-known characters, but this woman, Sarah Losh, is very little known. And as we've said already, she doesn't leave behind lots of letters and records. And I'm interested also because she's living in a part of Britain, in Cumbria, which isn't written about very much. And yet, at the beginning of the 19th century, anything that had been in the 19th century, it has an extraordinarily vivid commercial and intellectual life of its own.
Yes, it's quite true. I think all the people I've written about tend to be critics, or in the case of Charles II, the focus of an extraordinary period of change. So perhaps I think you understand history, or you understand cities, or you understand problems more when you identify with one or two people in the middle of them. And I was very drawn to this area, to this person and this area, because it's such a borderland. I mean, it has this great sort of ancient history of Scotland and England, the kind of
moss troopers and the reivers.
The moss troopers and the reivers. But then also at this particular point is a sort of east-west thing in that the Cumbrians go over to the Tyne to make their fortunes in Newcastle, and the weavers come from Ireland, which is fascinating, to Carlisle, which has its own problems, and then the railways come. So you feel everything is funneling through this strange, beautiful, but actually quite lost area.
And using my image of the sort of the mirrors all around the central character, so you see sort of glints of Wordsworth and Coleridge and the French Revolution through the brothers and the uncles, and Carlyle appears, and the age of the railways and industrialisation, the Gothic revival. This is a way of writing about England in the 19th century and bringing in all sorts of unexpected connections that you couldn't do, perhaps, if you were writing a sort of conventional history book.
No, that's quite true, but they're all glints that affect Sarah Losh, who's my heroine, affect her life, affect the way that she sees things, so that I'm not interested in putting kind of blocks of context or history behind, or indeed of writing a history, but it's much more experiencing it as you live through it. And it's very surprising. And also, that's the wonderful thing about writing about a life rather than attempting to write as a history, is that these things hang like a kind of, we have that trajectory of the life, of the childhood and the growing up, even if they're different. And these things sort of ranged in the background, so you don't have to do cause or effect, or this happened.
Yes.
It's like the demolitions in Delhi, which are political acts, but we learn about them there because they're affecting these lives.
We should come on to the extraordinary church at Rhea itself, and you were talking about the pine cone is very important to Sarah, but there's all sorts of other odd geological and animal references.
Yes, it is an extraordinary church, and one of the great mysteries is how on earth the Bishop of Carlisle let it be consecrated. I tried very hard to find some furious memo in the Bishop's archives, but they all seem to have gone. Because I think she's someone who is very involved with the present and political reform and things like that, but actually to make sense of the place in the world, she looks perpetually to the past, to what has gone before, to the architecture of the region, to the layers of history, and then this great extending sense of time that they had just at the start of the Victorian era, with the geological discoveries, the discoveries of the fossils, the dinosaurs.
There's a wonderful thing I didn't know about a bunch of labourers have this huge collection of bones they're using to grind up and line the roads, and it turns out they're rhinoceros and mammoth bones and so on.
It happens. This bloke who knows is walking along and says, what are those? So that there can be this haphazard chances that throw you back eons, and I think that's probably what the church is about with its fossils. It's extraordinary, no cross, but it has lotus candlesticks, ancient ideas of the earth living through time. So it's quite a pantheistic.
It's a really pantheistic and radical building, Roger.
Yeah, I mean, answering your own question about the Bishop of Carlisle, so it seemed to me that Sarah pulled a fast one on all the people around,
yes,
by saying, I'm only just redoing the old church, which happens now with contemporary buildings, that people say, it's just a small revision, and suddenly there's this thing that goes up that's much bigger. So she was obviously very canny and using her authority and her sister. She wasn't just a kind of innocent believer. She was very much on top of things.
That's true. I think she grew up with this extraordinary family of her father and uncles who were radicals and were revolutionary. And I suppose, though you don't need to say it again because it's a life in terms of feminism or in terms of what women did, she would have liked to be all the things that the men could be, but actually she just took that authority into herself, so she manipulates every man that comes her way.
Very modern.
And you've also got an unusual female life in the 19th century, which is nothing to do with marriage, children, all the things that tend to shape so many female lives. With her sister, she strikes out by herself and stays alone.
Yes, she does, and she was devoted to her sister, and I think the two of them turned down offers and chose to live singly and together, and that's another interesting relationship that's not written about a lot. It's difficult to write about sibling relationships.
Aman.
One of the things I was actually kind of interested in was this idea of transmission of knowledge, in the sense of how do you, Sarah Lush, in this small particular place in the middle of, excuse me, I come from India, but in the middle of nowhere, basically decide to make like lotuses or turtles or gargoyles, and where does this knowledge begin from? Because there is a sense these days when you kind of draw these genealogies of knowledge, you're like, people read the papers, or there's the internet, but when you try and think of kind of an oral transmission of knowledge, I found that actually kind of interesting in the book. Where does this knowledge kind of begin, and what are the ripple effects as it moves from one holder of knowledge to another holder of knowledge?
Yes, that ripple effect is very interesting, because here you're at the end of a line with a woman who makes something, literally three-dimensional, because she carved quite a lot herself, out of whole sets of ideas, and that was one of the tracks that I was following. Some of the historical thing comes from folklore, or simply what she saw as a child, or journeys they make to see these strange Celtic crosses. And then you also have at the time, this very, very interesting amateur groups or informal groups all across Britain who are collecting knowledge about the past, or who are geologists who are going and digging things up, or who are learning about science. And so I could find what she read, I could find what her uncles read, and then you realise that it isn't a question of her thinking of making lots of notes. These are the things that strike her imagination she uses.
Kevin?
One of the things I loved about it, which I think Andrew's already touched on, is the regionalism of it, is the fact that this is not about the centre, but it's about smaller centres dotted around. And I think that's something that maybe we've lost, particularly in Britain and in Germany. They have lots of regional capitals, but here we don't. And so it's the idea that there isn't just one canon of historical figures, of poets, of architects, and actually that there are many different perspectives from which to look at that period. And I think that opening up is what all of documentary should do. They should make things more complicated, make us see things from different perspectives rather than narrowing our perspectives.
Yes, in a way it's what you were saying about the layering, but also there's that, when one's working on it, there's that constant element of surprise, and that's a delight to pass on.
Roger?
All I was going to say is the other star of the book is Carlisle, and it makes you really think about that place, and which has been a place I've gone through many times, and I want to go back there and study, because it's got layers just like Kevin.
It's very interesting. So she builds the church, and then nothing much happens, I suspect, until quite recently, when people focus on the church and then focus on her story in Carlisle, and the baton is passed again.
Yes, the village lies on a sort of ledge on the end of a valley. It's still very quiet, even though the railway and the M6 are sort of nearby. And occasional people came through, like Rossetti, who said, what a genius she is. And then recently, I suppose you're right, we've noticed it all over again. And the people in the village, what's the most important, have always loved it and used it.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you to everybody. We have run out of time. Kevin Macdonald is this year's winner of the Grierson Trustees Award, and his newest film, Marley, is available on DVD. Roger Graef will be giving the keynote speech in January at a conference on current affairs television, and you can see The Truth About Adoption on the BBC iPlayer. Jenny Uglow's The Pinecone and Aman Sethi's A Free Man, A True Story of Life and Death in Delhi are both out now. Next week, we're going to be talking about the future of art and design with Anthony Gormley, Christopher Frayling and Ron Arad. But for now, thanks a lot for listening and goodbye.
There are many more Radio 4 arts and discussion programmes to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio4.
A brilliant film, but you have no idea of what that brilliant film is going to be. And so I think you become a bit mystical, actually, because you sort of believe that something will come up, and you will meet those great people. And I remember it was halfway through the making of this film, and I thought, I haven't discovered anything that isn't already in common knowledge.
So there's that period of panic,
and there is a period of total panic, and then suddenly it clicks, and you do a couple of interviews with people, and my God, there's a whole different way of looking at this man's life, and you start to understand him in a what you think yourself anyway. You think you understand him in a deeper way. But the other thing that happens, of course, when you make this sort of film is that you are always defining your subject through the words of others. So he's a sort of negative space in the middle. And so by the end of the film, I feel like, I feel like the audience know Bob, but they don't really know him. They know what everybody else has said about him. Of him for the first 26 years of his life, only a handful of photographs. In fact, he reminded me a little bit of your subject, Jenny, who again is in some way absent in the biography. And so that was what interested me, was just who was this man that we all think we know, but we don't know? And
yet when you set out, you don't know what interviews you're going to get. In fact, I think Bob Marley's daughter, who remains very angry with him, was a sort of pivotal and crucial interviewee that you found for the film. But you don't know, presumably, when you start making the film, what the quality is of the...
No, that's the sort of adventure of making these sorts of films, is that you have to just decide to make it, and then accept what you're given, and find things that are good. You've taken the check, you've got the commission from the commission editors, and you've told them you're going to make
conventional biographical storytellers. And I'm going to start by talking to a man whose films have won him recently a very major award, the Grierson, and whose latest film's a portrait of that iconic musician, Jamaica's Bob Marley. Kevin, it's an obvious question, I suppose, Kevin Macdonald, but how do you choose a biographical subject? Because a lot of your films are, as it were, conventional narrative feature films.
Well, in the case of Marley, I suppose what interested me was that here's someone who is apparently so well known around the world. You can go almost anywhere in the world, and there are murals of Bob Marley. You hear his music in marketplaces from, Delhi to Indonesia, and yet there isn't very much really known about him as a man. He only gave a handful of interviews, and he's really frustrating and infuriating in the few interviews he did give. He doesn't give much away. There is no moving foot. And, of course, there's lots of lies and deceptions. And
still the negative sort of hovering presence sort of darkly in the middle of it all.
Exactly. No, that makes for an interesting subject as well, though, doesn't it? Because he retains some mystique, some mystery. He's not fully defined as a person, and that makes a legend, I suppose.
So we understand now why you go for that subject. Aman Sethi, in your book, A Free Man, again, actually, you've got somebody who is a presence throughout the book, but is constantly telling little parts of stories about his life, which we may or may not believe, and refusing to reveal crucial other parts of his life. So in a sense, there is a sort of parallel, I think, there. But how did you start to settle out in this sort of project to tell the story of a group of day labourers in Delhi?
Well, the project sort of took shape because in the run.
Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello, well, it's that time of year when publishers are hoping that millions of people will be out buying books for presents for Christmas. And it has to be said that the best-selling lists at the moment are stuffed with celeb biographies and memoirs. None of that, I am delighted to report, with us today, but we did think it was a good moment to talk about rather more interesting biography, both on the page and the screen. I'm joined by Aman Sethi, author of a cracking book about a house painter and his mates living on the streets of Delhi, by Roger Graef, the award-winning documentary filmmaker, who homes in on the lives of doctors, sick children, prisoners and many more, by the fine and rather unusual biographer Jenny Uglow, whose latest book's about a little-known but extraordinary Cumbrian woman. So none of them can